Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Now, earlier this week, the chairperson of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry, Justice Sisi Khampepe, announced further preparatory consultative meeting for those who did not participate in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The inquiry will look into allegations made by 23 families in pending High Court proceedings that there has been political interference in the TRC cases. She, of course, gave this media briefing at the Hector Peterson Memorial in Soweto, indicating that the Commission will ensure that victims of apartheid-era crimes find the closure that they deserve, and adding that anyone who wishes to participate will be given a chance to present their case before her commission. Joining me now, I'd like to welcome Yasmin Sooka. And of course, you would have remembered Ms. Yasmin Sooka during those days of the TRC Commission. She, of course, served as a commissioner for it. Ms. Sooka, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Ms. Sooka, just listening to, of course, the media briefing that was done by Justice Khampepe, how important is it that these preparatory consultative meetings are happening so that, given what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was at the time, that not only does it begin a sense of the road to closure, but that there's an understanding as to what this phase of the inquiry is going to be?
Thank you. I mean, as a representative of the Foundation for Human Rights, which is one of the applicants in the case, which asked for the Commission of Inquiry to be set up. Excuse me, I was really pleased that, Judge Khampepe announced that there would be this preparatory meeting and that it would be fairly extensive and consultative, which would really allow, I think, the victims and families to indicate what their expectations are of the Commission. I think that, symbolically, the fact that she held this first briefing at the Hector Peterson Museum was also a signal that she's deeply concerned about the fact that for more than 30-odd years, families of victims have waited for justice. And of course, the big question is what happened in those intervening years, which has led to this commission, which will really be the focus of her job. And so, there are a lot of questions that we need answered before this process begins. For instance, the question of legal representation for victims and their families. Secondly, will the commission be providing trauma support? Who's going to decide on the list of witnesses? What kind of input will the families have? And will we be able to make submissions to her about the kind of witnesses that we think should be led? And how is she going to deal with the question of subpoenaing people? What kind of access to records will she have? And, she noted when she did the briefing that she had a research team on standby as well. And so, I think all of this is important to understand, how they're actually all going to function together and what kind of input the victims and families will have. So that preparatory meeting is quite important.
Ms. Sooka, within what she said, of course, this TRC cases or inquiry will adopt a more sympathetic, engaging and empowering approach, given that, of course, it has been quite a long time since, of course, we've had a very similar hearing to this, given that this was to, of course, probe apartheid-era crimes. Those words over there, sympathetic, engaging and empowering approach, how important is it when we look at the year 2025 as opposed to maybe that just before the turn of the millennium?
It's a very interesting question because I do think that sympathetic and empathetic, yes, towards the victims and the families who've been directly affected in terms of the violations of their rights. But I also think that the Commission is going to need to take quite a firm inquisitorial style when dealing with people who are what we call implicated parties. In other words, the state officials who are involved in having suppressed the prosecution and investigation of cases. And there, I would expect the Commission to adopt a very robust approach. The other thing, while I think families are going to be able to come forward, we don't expect that this will be a rerun of the TRC process. And I do think that that's why this meeting is important, so that we can also clarify, who is going to testify, what kind of evidence will this commission want to hear? And because, it's not going to be simply saying, everybody come forward and come and tell your story. That's not what it's about. The real expectation is going to be around, these are the actions, at the end of the day, the commission handed over a list of more than 300 cases to the state. Nothing happened to them. Individual families also made representations to the NPA and the police. And, one would expect that that's the kind of thing we're going to focus on. What happened to thought their desire to have action and justice taken here.
Yasmin Sooka, you bring up quite an important point there. 300 cases have been brought. I would like to think that all 300 cases will be dealt with on merit, given that these are apartheid-era crimes, and of course it has to be dealt with. Within the period that has been given for the Khampepe Commission, are you confident that all 300 of these cases, or even closer to that number, can be probed and that they can buy a finality with regards to that?
The 300 cases, to some extent, really signify, the cases that were handed over. But if you take those together, what we're looking at is the unlawful conduct of the state in refusing to investigate and prosecute those cases. So that's not going to require that each individual case is looked at. But I do think that what the Commission will need to do is perhaps to do an analysis and a selection of cases and say, let's examine these cases and let's look at the way in which the state dealt with each one of these cases, so that at least you have a fairly, robust view of what happened during this last period. But will they have the capability to go through all 300? Quite honestly, I don't think that's realistic. But what they will need to do is, in fact, to make recommendations on how the South African police and, of course, the National Prosecutorial Authority will have to deal with these cases in the aftermath. Remember, in the papers that we filed, we make the point that, in fact, for many families, the prospect of finding the truth or even having prosecutions is very limited, because in most instances, perpetrators have passed on. And of course, what they've taken to the grave with them is the knowledge they have and of the role they and other people played in these cases. And just to give you, one example, when you look at the case of the Craddock 4, for instance, while the inquest began last year, it did so at a time when most of the the people who were named as people who should have been brought before the inquest have passed on. And of the 49 names that we listed at one point for the NPA, only 7 of them remain alive, and only one of them who was directly implicated in the planning and authorization. And even he is in his late 70s. So you can see that with the passage of time, the prospect of justice is remote. And I think that's something that we would expect a research team to really begin to identify as well. The way in, because remember, the other angle to this case is the question of constitutional damages. And so when you look at the fact that there are more than 300 families for whom justice has been denied because of the obstruction by the state and its agencies. One also has to look at the way in which their justice prospects were obstructed. And that will mean that you look at these individual cases to get a sense of what actually happened and who was responsible. And so from that perspective, I think there's going to need to be quite a good, I think, analytical team. Of course, we will try to assist them because remember, we are familiar with many of these cases, but it takes a lot of time, and I think 6 months is probably 6 months for her to determine through the inquiry which state officials were implicated, and that may be what she can achieve in the 6-month period.
After the break, are we going to go back in time? We're going to go to, of course, that period between 1996 to 1999 when that TRC commission had happened. And of course, my guest, Yasmin Sooka, was a commissioner at the time. We're going to be discussing how that period was being conducted, given that we had just entered a democratic era in South Africa. Do stay tuned. This conversation continues after the break. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Yasmin Sooka. She served as a commissioner at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Again, thank you so much for staying with us, Ms. Sooka. Ms. Sooka, let's go to, of course, it's established in 1995. We've got, of course, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu leading the proceedings. You yourself would, of course, experience apartheid, the darkest of all of those days. And here we have, of course, victims of apartheid-era crimes, perpetrators of apartheid-era crimes. We have you, of course, being a commissioner. Talk to us about, as somebody who was given this task by the late Archbishop to say, we need to make sure that not only is there a sense of reconciliation, but accountability at the time. Talk to us about that, how there had to be a separation between emotion and, of course, doing the job at hand.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that's quite a critical question. And so, I was struck by the words that the judge used, sympathetic and empathetic, because, that was certainly, the philosophy that kind of ran through the work of the Truth Commission, that it should be accessible to victims and their families, and of course to perpetrators as well. And also that, one of the things we should do is display empathy. But I do think that it was also important that we focused on what we call the truth recovery and accountability part. And that required that one had to be much more sharper focused and really look at the question of investigation so that you could actually do a good job. Because at the end of the day, what was at stake was the truth not only for the individual families, but also the truth for our society about what had happened. Because, like the Archbishop said on many occasions, it was really interesting. This commission traveled around the country. We took the commission to the people. I think there wasn't, any part of the country that we didn't really touch. And we really made an effort to make sure that, we were able to solicit the views of people and to do the documentation work properly, but also to give those of them who wanted to have an opportunity to testify publicly. But that did mean that the commission itself had to run a very well-oiled engine. We had an 8-week cycle in which you did the outreach program, you did the documentation, you organized hearings, and thereafter you began the process of investigations and corroboration. And then, of course, that led to the question of findings, which then gave you an entry point into the reparations process. The one thing I think that was quite awe-inspiring really was the willingness of people, despite their pain, to come forward and speak about what had happened to them. And for many, many families, this was the first time that they spoke to any official body about what had happened to loved ones. I think for the commissioners, it was a real shock because while you had an idea of what the apartheid state had done, I think what really shocked us was how systematic and organized it was. So it didn't matter whether you went to the Northern Cape or whether you went to a place like Polokwane, the violence was the same. And the systemic nature of it was the same. And that gave you a real sense of how orchestrated it was and how very much a part of state's policy, state-sponsored violence was. And, that really, I think, gave, buttressed the notion that apartheid was a crime against humanity. And we saw that firsthand going around the country.
Ms. Sooka, I remember those days because obviously you would get it in pieces of news bulletins within the SABC. And of course, myself as a primary school going pupil at the time, it was very difficult to actually understand. You look at it now, you actually understand how devastating it was for the victims of these apartheid era crimes. From an emotional perspective, Ms. Sooka, how challenging was it just to look at, for example, an old woman who had to come forward and somehow find a sense of reconciliation to the perpetrator of that very same crime? Talk to us about that, because it's very difficult, especially as someone like yourself, Ms. Sooka, was a mother who has that sense of warmness as a mother, to say we can try and understand the feeling that is going through that very same person right now, given how much of destruction and how much of emotional damage they went through during those dark days in our country.
It's I would say that the commission quite early on, understood that in fact, while the underlying philosophy of this process was the notion of Ubuntu, and that within ourselves we had to find the way in which we could live with each other, we were also very clear that a commission cannot force individuals to forgive or to reconcile. That's a very individual choice that is made by families. And so what we dealt with in the commission, I think, was the question of political reconciliation. And that is really establishing the basis on which we can engage with each other truthfully. The question of forgiveness and I think remorse, and then ultimately reconciliation, we saw the work that we were doing as laying the basis for that. But we also never, I think, got to the point where we could say to a victim, oh, you must reconcile and forgive this person, because I think that was wrong. The other question that I think came up quite early was the question of trauma and the fact that South Africa, I think at a deep level, is a very traumatized country. And so the commission did try to make sure that as families spoke to the commission, they were provided with support, and of course in the aftermath as well. And then, of course, within the staff of the commission and the media, it became very clear that, in fact, people were absorbing the pain that they were encountering, and that for many of them, it was beginning to affect them quite deeply. And that is when the commission also brought on board an in-house trauma counselor who then began to hold, daily support sessions with people who needed it. But, I think many people argue about the fact, they say that this was a commission about forgiveness and reconciliation. And we made very, very clear that forgiveness is an incredibly personal issue. Yes, it's necessary if you want to move on, as many scholars of this kind of work will tell you. But, to do that, you also need an acknowledgement of what happened and what went wrong, an acknowledgement by the perpetrator, an acknowledgement by the state, and then, of course, reparations, which is deeply meaningful in the life of victims. And then only you can actually move to a state in which you can live side by side without fear that in the morning you're going to wake up dead because your neighbor didn't like you, because this was the South Africa that we lived in prior to 1993. that almost on a daily basis people were being attacked. And so we understood that the reconciliation was really going to be about recognition, acknowledgement, and laying the basis for reparations so that people can live side by side with each other, recognizing that they all live in the same space and in the same country. But did that mean that they had to love each other and move on as if nothing happened? No, I don't think so. And therein also lies one of the challenges. You know, I think that part of the way in which the Truth Commission operated is that you almost got the perception that the people who did it didn't belong to communities. And so you had this array of mainly white men who came before the commission. They weren't supported by their politicians who kind of denied that they'd in fact authorized and instructed them to carry out these atrocities. And so you have a lot of what I call a beneficiary community, a white community moving back and saying, oh my God, we didn't know that these things were happening. We didn't actually support apartheid. And in fact, if you ask people today, most of them will claim they never supported apartheid. And I think that gap has meant that the beneficiaries of apartheid didn't participate in a national reparations effort. And for me, that's, I think, one of the challenges of moving forward in South Africa, because it was too easy. And people don't recognize the enormous sacrifice that was made by victims who didn't demand at that point that perpetrators be prosecuted. Because remember, under international law, when you commit serious human rights violations, then, of course, the state is obliged to investigate and to prosecute. And that didn't happen in our country. Now, the reason why this Commission of Inquiry is also being set up is because the law which set up the commission also said if you did not apply or if you were refused amnesty because you didn't make full disclosure, then the law would follow its course. And in a 30-year period, the state didn't honor that obligation. And that's the conduct that this Judicial Commission of Inquiry will be looking at.
Ms. Yasmin Sooka, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us on News in Focus.
Thank you.
That's Yasmin Sooka. She's a former commissioner at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. After the break, I'm going to be speaking with Mametlwe Sibai from the General Industrial Workers Union of South Africa. Yesterday, they led a march to the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, calling for an end of energy trade with Israel as the genocide in Gaza continues. Do stay tuned.